Hello to everybody. My name is Hernán Sorrentini, and I'm a professor at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences at the National University of La Plata. I'd like to welcome you all again to the third cycle of conferences that we are holding as part of this new joint project between the USA and Argentina, Shared Dialogues on Gender, Ethnicity, Geopolitics, History, and Memory. The project is one of the beneficiaries of the US Embassy in Argentina's grant program for cooperation and exchange projects. The University of La Plata is extremely grateful to the Embassy for choosing and sponsoring this series of conferences. At these events, 22 professors from the USA and Argentina discuss and call into question the connections, intersections, and points of contact between concepts such as ethnicity, class, feminism, testimonial literature, translation, and the decolonial term. The talks are also a wonderful opportunity to discuss issues on language teaching, geopolitics, history, and memory. This evening, we will have the 7th session of this series of virtual conferences called Colonial Inheritances, Popular Memories, and Intersectionality in the Social Mobilizations of Our Time. I would like to thank Ana Principi, the Undersecretary of Interinstitutional Relations of our school, who is the coordinator of the whole project, and to the director of our master program in History and Memory, Ana Barletta, and the director of the Human Rights Department, Lucia Batista, for the organization of these conferences in particular. I'm now pleased to hand over my colleague, Cecilia Chiaccio, who will introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Temma Kaplan.
Thank you, Hernan. Thank you, Temma, for being here. Temma Kaplan graduated from Brandeis University and obtained her PhD in history from Harvard. She is distinguished professor emerita at Rutgers University, now retired. She's a comparative historian interested in women, gender, and sexuality, and their impacts on political culture in Spain, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, South Africa, and the United States. Along her career, she has studied a wide range of topics, including Spanish anarchism, puppet theater, modern art, photography, political cartoons, historical memory, and various forms of direct democratic movements in Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the United States. She has published Anarchists of Andalusia, 1868-1903, and Red City, Blue Period, Social Movements in Picasso's Barcelona, both translated into Spanish. Her later publications include the books Crazy for Democracy from 1997, Taking Back the Streets, Women, Youth, and Direct Democracy, 2004, and Democracy, A World History, 2015. We can mention also 2 of her articles available in Spanish translations, Conciencia Femenina y Acción Colectiva, El Caso de Barcelona, and Revertir la Culpa y Revelar el Género de la Memoria, the latter published by the journal Mora of the University of Buenos Aires. She has taught undergraduate and graduate courses on topics such as women and gender history, social movements of women in comparative perspective, art, war, and politics, history and historical novels, and political and popular culture. Her talk this evening is entitled The Me Too Movement and the Long March Against Sexual Harassment in the United States. So thank you, Temma, again, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for the invitation. It's quite wonderful to be here with all of you old friends and some new friends as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the Me Too movement and the questions of sexual harassment as part of political struggle. And while the Me Too movement may always be identified with sexual abuse of famous actresses in Hollywood, the fight for the dignity of working class women of all races and nationalities long precedes the events of 2017. In fact, what is known as the Me Too movement in the United States helps cast light on the connection between civil rights and freedom from sexual harassment that has generally been ignored or underestimated. In the United States, attempts at civil rights advocates like Rosa Parks, generally for launching the U.S. civil rights movement on December 1st, 1955, when she refused to give up her seat on a bus to make way for a white man, actually began her career more than 11 years earlier as a civil rights advocate by documenting the rape of Black women in the South. Even before actresses spoke about how they were sexually abused in order to win jobs in Hollywood, women agricultural, household, hotel, and factory workers fought for and sometimes won their freedom from sexual abuse all over the world. And this issue of revealing things that largely people know and yet don't want to know, it has a long history in relations to sexual matters. In Argentina, the Mire como os ponemos of December 18th, 2018, fought against, revealed sexual abuse that had taken place in Nicaragua, as most of you know, and by a woman who was 16 at the time the abuse occurred. So the memories, bringing forth these memories, has a tradition that is both current and past. In fact, telling secrets and bringing forth these secrets goes back for a long time, but probably was most similar to what's going on now. On April 5th, 1971, French women signed a notice, and these French women included Simone de Beauvoir, Catherine Deneuve, Jean Moreau, Marguerite Duras, Françoise Sagan, Agnes Varda, and 250 others, saying that they had had illegal abortions. So this was a secret that people knew but didn't tell. Nobody went, but using their fame and using their prominence in the world, they could get a hearing and help begin to change the abortion laws. It took a long time. I mean, they started in 1971. There were some changes, and by 1991, France and Germany permitted abortions. Similarly, the stories of working class women, as well as women in all jobs, has tended to be a secret and has tended to be not told, because sexual harassment is even more widespread than attacks on women. That is, sexual discrimination and the forbidding of the attacks on working class women is more prevalent all over the world, even than the attacks on middle class women. So Rosa Parks, for example, is widely known for sitting down, for launching the civil rights movement, and she should be known for launching the civil rights movement in the United States. But actually, she began her career more than 11 years earlier as a civil rights advocate by documenting the rape of Black women in the South. Even before the actresses spoke up about how they were sexually abused in order to win jobs in Hollywood, women agricultural, household, hotel, and factory workers fought for and sometimes won their freedom from sexual abuse all over the world. I'm focusing on the United States because it's been documented more widely, but you could write this history for almost any country in the world right now, of the revelations of people beginning to talk about, of women beginning to talk about the challenges that they've spoken And it's not only it's not only women, but women and people of color of all genders, but also about men who have been sexually harassed by other men, and sometimes by women as well. Historians have always had trouble explaining how challenges to existing social relations emerge, ultimately sweep through entire countries, and then sometimes assume new organizational form. And part of the problem is that revolutionary changes at first affect a small number of people and result in slightly different outcomes. Practically everywhere these movements occur, they build on pre-existing formations, which in the United States, as in most other countries, always entails race, ethnicity, and class. Although sexual harassment may vary by class and race and nationality, the literal body politic is the same across most nations. One reason that the movements like Me Too are intelligible all over the world. People keep secrets. The things that they most suffer from are often the things they keep most secret. This has been a part of the difficulty of changing all kinds of social relations. Class and race always play a role. So when Oprah Winfrey appeared before a Hollywood audience to accept a Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Award in early January 2018, she spoke about her working class mother who earned a living cleaning houses for people, and she praised the women of all classes and races who had launched the movement, the Me Too movement. And then she went on to tell a story that wasn't very widely known, but should be widely known, and can be, because a historian has written about what some of the part of the civil rights movement in the United States was a part of a movement among Black women to reveal the ways that they had been sexually attacked. But Winfrey told the story of Racy Taylor, who was a young African-American mother in rural Alabama, who was picked up by 6 armed white men while she was walking home from church in 1944. Her abductors took her to a side road and repeatedly raped her, and she begged for her life. When the men finished, they set her free, told her to walk her way home, but she wanted to tell authorities, but she had no recourse. In Alabama in 1944, a Black woman couldn't go to authorities and get any help from white authorities. But she and her Racy Taylor and her family turned to the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they sent one of their investigators, the political activist named Rosa Parks, to record Taylor's case, though they were unable to secure justice. 11 years later, in 1955, Parks set off the Montgomery bus boycott when she was arrested because she refused to give up her seat when a white bus driver ordered her to move to the back of the segregated bus. Now, one of the things that that historians have revealed in order to talk about this is the NAACP wanted to reveal the fact that Black people could not sit in anywhere they needed on a bus in Alabama and in many other places in the South of the United States. And there were various other people who refused to give up their seats and were punished by being arrested and so on. But they were not of the most esteemed, social situation. One was a teenager who was a teenager. She got around, and another had other problems. But they chose, in a sense, the NAACP and chose Rosa Parks, and she, as a longtime activist in the NAACP, chose or permitted. She was 33 years old, and she was an upstanding married woman who worked as a seamstress as well. And so in a sense, when she refused, it was easier to mount support from white people as well as Black people for her right not to have to, after a hard day's work, move to the back of the bus to make a place for a white man to sit down. 80% of those who supported Parks by boycotted the local buses for more than a year. They were African-American women who walked many miles in the heat and stormy weather to and from their jobs as maids and cooks in white people's homes, where they worked to support their families. And this story is a story of incredible social movement and heroism of these Black women who worked full-time for other people and then worked full-time as mothers and housekeepers and so on. Winfrey talked about this story, and she connected that story to the sexual abuse of women, quote, whose names we'll never know. They are the domestic workers and the farm workers. They are working in factories and they work in restaurants. They're in academia and engineering and medicine and science. They're part of the world technological and political businesses. There are athletes in the Olympics. There are soldiers in the military. They are all there and they are all working, but many of them do not have the equal rights to white people in similar positions. Winfrey must have known that many of the women of races and classes she was describing were in the audience. And the Me Too movement had first gained notice in mainstream newspapers when it seemed focused on glamorous survivors and powerful male abusers. As a mass phenomenon, it had inflamed the headlines in October 2017, commanding wide world interest, partly because it was at first associated with sexual scandals in Hollywood. And who wasn't interested in sexual scandals in Hollywood? Without referring to the systemic abuse of young girls and women of color and other working class women, the actresses, Rose McGowan and Alicia Milano, had in early February 2017 first denounced the film producer Harvey Weinstein. McGowan publicly claimed that Weinstein had raped her 20 years earlier in 1997, so she was much younger, at the Sundance Film Festival. Then, on October 15, 2017, using the term Me Too that a friend had recalled from a similar context, actress and political activist Alicia Milano sent out a tweet, and many of you probably know about this, sent out a tweet asking people to report on the internet, and the quote was, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too," as a reply to the tweet. No one was more surprised than she was to receive 55,000 responses overnight. And within 45 days, 85 million posts from women all over the world appeared on Facebook. That's an incredible mobilization. We don't, even though we're all part of some kinds of the use of Facebook and the use of emails for political purposes, we don't recognize that it changes the world. We can reach many more people. We can bring news when the newspapers aren't publishing it. It's relatively, well, not in all countries, but it's relatively free from authorities until it gets very powerful. When African-American social worker Tarana Burke noted that having worked since 2006 with young women of color between the ages of 12 and 18 who were survivors of sexual assaults and first claimed the term or coined the term Me Too, to associate herself with the plight of these young women of color, Milano quickly welcomed Miss Burke to the leadership of the protesting group. It was very courageous of Burke. I mean, it turned out these actresses, were potentially liberal and they were open to this issue, but essentially it could have been a middle-class helping movement But Burke, was also very courageous that she spoke up. And, we've been doing this for a long time. Don't take this movement. And they were happy not to take the movement, but they didn't know her and they didn't know the work she had been doing. Burke, who had become a senior director of Girls for Gender Equality in Brooklyn, New York, continues to work with poor young women, helping them to gain self-confidence and to take their place in the world. In fact, when Time magazine released its widely recognized Person of the Year for 2017, instead of Donald Trump, who had just won the election in the United States and probably expected that the issue would focus on him, the Time surprised everyone. They devoted the issue to Me Too and offer as a subtitle, The Silence Breakers, the voices that launched a movement. In it, they wrote about women of all races who had fought against sexual harassment as workers in hotels, private homes, restaurants, factories, and farms. Shortly after Time published its choices on December 18, 2017, various actresses decided to invite their working class counterparts to accompany them to the public event scheduled to take place a few weeks later. So when Ajahn Poo, executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, one of the first and most encompassing organization of maids and household workers all over the world, picked up her phone, she was completely flabbergasted to hear it was Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep was inviting her to accompany her to a ceremony that was going to take place a few weeks later. So, there were liberal actors and actresses who joined, and they were happy to do it, but it wouldn't accompany them. They had no connections to working class organizations or some of these unions. A lot of even liberal and leftist people in the United States don't know about a lot and haven't known about these unions of household workers and of factory workers. More or less at the same time, actor Michelle Williams invited Tarana Burke, and Laura Dern invited Monica Ramirez, a civil rights lawyer who co-founded the Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. Agriculture, a quarter of all the goods grown in the United States, a quarter of all fruits and vegetables eaten in the United States comes from the Central Valley of California, and where 900,000 farm workers, a large number of whom are immigrants, legal and occupational immigrants from Mexico, who grow on a side issue. I mean, they are now going 25 feet down into the valley to try to get water because the water is drying up in this valley as it's drying up in so many places. And they're chopping down walnut trees because almond trees because they use up too much water, and they're chopping down asparagus because it takes too much water. So, and this is one of the most fertile valleys in the world, and it's happening all over the world. But the discrimination is caught up in this because it's not getting any better for the people of color who bring all the food forth, and so drawing on these women who are as part of a group that a large number of middle-class white women didn't know about. So Ramirez argued that together we can end sexual assault, harassment, and inequality in the workforce among migrant farm workers and low-paid immigrant women. Since women in the entertainment industry, as much as they might oppose mostly male sexual abuse of women and gay men, did not ordinarily reach out to hotel, household, farm, and auto workers, including new immigrants and other poor women of color subject to sexual abuse, than the Hollywood stars knew, many people suspected that something might be changing. that some channels of information and cooperation might be opening up. If the ceremony was all that followed, it would have been an instance of Hollywood self-congratulation. But in fact, while the denunciations in Hollywood, television, business, and educational institutions largely focused on the perpetrators, the poorer women and their defenders were concerned with how to make far-reaching structural changes to working and living conditions, to reframe social and sexual relations in the whole society. In the United States, the election of 2016 itself brought around some of the changes that have reverberated in the United States. In the United States, 2016 brought about a political crisis that has yet to be resolved. More a constitutional republic than a democracy, the United States decides presidency and vice presidency according to who wins majorities in each of the 50 states, rather than who wins the majority of the total votes cast. People vote by state, and they count the votes of the state. And one knows now, at the manipulations that are going on increasingly at the state level. The fact that Hillary Clinton, the first woman to run for president of the United States as a candidate of a major political party, received 3 million more votes than Trump in 2016, outraged many women and some men all over the nation. Unlike most candidates for president, Trump, a businessman with a widely publicized career in the entertainment industry, had not been able to hide past scandals. The 2016 revelation of the Access Hollywood tape highlighting Trump's womanizing and his failure to conform to any moral constraints impelled many women and some men to take action. On November 9th, 2016, the day after the election, 60-year-old feminist grandmother of 4, Teresa Shuk, woke up in her home in Hawaii and decided that she had to contact other people. She turned to the internet and she sent out a text suggesting a women's march in Washington on January 21st, 2017, the day after Trump's inauguration as president. On November 10th, she received 10,000 affirmative responses. Ultimately, 3 to 5 million people came to this march that she started organizing by phone. She and feminist Bob Bland alerted women of color, Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, Carmen Perez, activists in prisoner rights movements, Black Lives Matter, and Islamic American causes, as well as women from all classes and races to join the leadership. The so-called third wave of feminism in the United States assumed its most spectacular organizational form with the 3 to 5 million men, women, trans people, and straight people who participated in the Women's March of January 2017. Scarcely 9 months later, the Me Too movement was born. And I think it's impossible to see the Me Too movement outside of a political context, which has to do with the resistance and growing anger toward Trump and the political party. Almost instantaneously, Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, made up largely of Mexican-American women, farm workers, and their families, made themselves known. They claim to represent some of the 700,000 female farm workers who are said to suffer in silence because of the widespread sexual harassment they face in their work on a regular basis, end of quote. The statement later appeared in Time magazine's special edition, where they went on to add, quote, even though we work in very different environments, we share a common experience of being preyed upon by individuals who have the power to hire, fire, blacklist, and otherwise threaten our economic, physical, and emotional security, end of quote. The courage and solidarity of these women, a large proportion of whom were undoubtedly undocumented workers, and that's the whole other issue of people in the United States, how hard it is to get citizenship, how difficult it is. But this idea that they had undoubtedly was not lost on the audiences of over 300 women who worked in television, film, and theater and the arts. The group, the so-called entertainment in the so-called entertainment industry, responded by claiming to support women farm workers in their efforts. And the National Women's Law Center almost immediately raised $15 million to aid women farm workers who attempted to bring their legal grievances to court. And they've continued to support these legal supporters. And suddenly, people have begun to realize, the sexual harassment of the women who work in the fields and grow a quarter of all food eaten in the United States. In the United States, the hotel workers paved the way, actually, and set a standard for how to organize women and how to resist sexual harassment. And I never thought, I've been a political activist most of my life, but I never really thought about this until the 1990s. In the United States, the efforts of particularly those of whose customers met them standing naked as the maids entered their rooms to clean, continually threatened the safety of those forced to work alone, far from the scrutiny of people who might come to their aid. That that the people who clean hostels and beds are exploited everywhere. But I, as an activist, never really thought about the sexual harassment until a case I'm going to talk about. In fact, in 2011, 6 years before Me Too began grabbing headlines, a crisis publicized what cleaning staff of hotels often faced. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, head of the International Monetary Fund and widely believed to be in line to become the next president of France, was accused of assaulting the hotel worker, Nafissatou Diallo, an immigrant from Guinea, who was a single mother and the sole supporter of her daughter. According to Diallo, he attacked and raped her. When the hotel management refused to stand up for her, she hired a lawyer who specializes in cases of sexual harassment. Together with the support of local unions, who aren't always very good on these questions of sexual harassment of female workers, Diallo ultimately won a civil settlement reputed to be more than $1 million. Which he won in, so long ago that I hope she has other jobs, and I've never read about, which is good. I don't know what she's doing, and so it's not publicized. But that $1 million, over 2 years, and having to pay for all kinds of things, they may not be what it was. Like Diallo, 900,000 other primarily immigrant women all over the United States are employed cleaning hotel rooms, far from other employees or managers who might help them if a customer or a fellow worker attacked them. A survey of Chicago's Unite Here judged that 58% of women who worked in local hotels suffered sexual attacks by members of the staff as well as by visitors. In October 2017, just as Me Too was taking off online, Chicago City Council passed an ordinance labeled Hands Off, Pants On, that serves as a model for protecting women workers. Though not solving the problem entirely, the law stipulates that portable alarms known as panic buttons be provided to all the city's female hotel workers. Chicago also passed legislation preventing retaliation against workers who report a hotel guest attack or harassment. All in all, women trade union members refused to see themselves as victims and sought ways to gain control over their own working conditions. And some of the biggest fights also had to do with the men who were their co-workers, who also took advantage of them sexually, and they forced some of the unions to try to say this is not showing solidarity within the working class. The simple distribution of panic buttons seems to provide a model of how to establish national safety standards and reduce harassment of the cleaning staff throughout the United States. The New York Trades Council Coalition of Trade Union Women, called CLU, Unite Here in Chicago, the American Hotel and Lodging Association, and the Hands Off, Pants On group formed a loose coalition that in the fall of 2018 forced the 5 largest hotel chains in the United States to provide what's called these panic buttons to all workers, allowing them to call for help if a hotel guest or a member of a hotel isn't staff attempted to assault them. And male workers can ask for these if I think they're not given them as the women are. But this also has side effects in the sense that that when the workers ask that this be extended to all hotels in this distribution, these are like the Hilton hotels, the other, that are international hotels, that these buttons be buttons be distributed to all workers internationally. The hotels refuse to do it. They refused to distribute these. In other words, they didn't have to, and so they wouldn't. Similar campaigns developed in England, where the unions discovered that 89% of workers reported sexual harassment on the job, and but the unions in Britain haven't been strong enough to basically to enforce it and win these battles there, because they're and especially after COVID, where they've laid off so many of these workers who they regard as unskilled workers. But what makes the Me Too movement different from past struggles for political and social rights is that more than other campaigns in the United States, they built on the efforts of women of all races and classes to control their own bodies and define their personal and collective rights through direct action. According to Stanford University historian Estelle Friedman, we can look to African American women's struggles beginning in the 19th century for the initial movements that linked individual rights to collective demands. And that's been a hard thing in unions all over the world. In the United States, the civil rights movement helped fight against violence against women of all races and classes, helped lead the way. Me Too continues the struggle, taking it to the entertainment industry in Hollywood. The long suppressed rage that permeated the lives of many women worldwide began to find a means to make sexual abuse an important political and social issue. 3 feminist scholars from India, Argentina, and the United States were not surprised that the first group to express its solidarity with Me Too, the first group really to write to and call this actresses who had set out this thing, was the union of largely undocumented female farm workers from California who, quote, immediately recognized Harvey Weinstein not simply as a predator, but as a powerful boss. He could be a predator because he was such a powerful boss, able to dictate who would be allowed to work in Hollywood and who would not. When I asked a prominent American feminist and an old and dear friend for her view about why Me Too had occurred when it did, she said, quote, we had had enough and simply could not take it anymore. It was a cry of rage that no one could stop, and it reverberated around the world. So, thank you. So I'd like to, I don't know, you all may have ideas about similar situations or situations that haven't worked or whatever you want to talk about. I'd love to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Temma. I think it was a wonderful talk, many things to think about. And yeah, for sure we can bring some cases from other places, from here, Argentina, to start this conversation. I invite everybody. There is many people following us in the YouTube channel. Many people is saying hello. They are very happy with this initiative, and we invite them to ask their questions. It can be both in Spanish or English, where they prefer. We can manage this conversation in a relaxed way using both languages. And can I waiting for these questions, I can start saying the people that had said hello: Karen Santana, Florencia Carlevaro, they are following us from the YouTube. Brian Cini, Janina Boschetti says good afternoon. Maria Florencia Herrero. Many people that are following us. Mirna Rabia, it's saying greetings from Buenos Aires. Nadia Sanchez, Macarena Santi Esteban, saying thank you for creating this space for talking and exchange. So, Lucia, I thought you wanted to say something. Cecilia, I don't know.
Yes. While we wait for some questions, I would like
sure.
I would like to ask you something. These movements, like the Me Too movement, you very well. First of all, thank you for the insight you gave us. Yeah, but you made a point of how this movement has broken up some barriers, for instance, between the private and the public. How some private things became public or secrets. And I was thinking also of the theory and the practice, yeah. And I was thinking of the universities as academic places, how for some time the theory and the praxis in feminisms and in these movements have been, I wouldn't say divorced, but not so closely connected as they are today, maybe. So I'd like you to comment if you have worked with this in your studies, how these movements affect the academia in some way, how this opening to the private and the praxis and the fights for the bodies in the streets, as you said, go back to the academia, and if that changes the world of studies.
No, it's a very good question.
I don't know if I'm clear.
Yes, no, you're very clear. And it's had, sometimes the academic world is very cloistered, like a convent in some ways, and avoids certain things as long as they can avoid certain questions, certain issues. But, in terms of, women's studies helped, the development of field where for example, in history, where you could study women. I remember at one point, when one of my friends in one university was fighting to start to teach women's history of any way, one of the older fellows said, just didn't get it. And he said, well, how can we teach? We have so much to teach, like about shipping in the First World War, and Dreadnought and Scapa Flow, and the debates about which kind of ships you could use, and which the Germans and which the British use. So he didn't get it at all. And and then, you know, there was this a crisis in liberalism. One of the very sweet fellow, I thought, you know, an older man said to me, we had to, you know, we really, we didn't hire you because you were a woman. We hired you because you were good. And I said, you didn't know whether I was good or not. You hired me because I had gone, luckily, on scholarships and so on, to Harvard, and you thought Harvard was anything. In fact, I did a terrible PhD. I did it in 5 years because I was supposed to, for a grant. That, you know, that is the issues of what you know and what you don't know, and why you would try to open up. So they didn't know. I mean, a lot of these older men, you know, and there were some women who had found their way in, were treated in most despicably in most of the universities I know anything about. But they didn't know what to do with all of these young women who wanted, not all of them who wanted to study women. They were just women. They, you know, that's by incident. They were studying all kinds of things. They didn't know what to do. So that was a political struggle, but it was also a political struggle which in some places, you know, one of the things we tried to do is also find out what the people who cleaned the buildings were being paid. They were all women, and what, you know, and what their lives were like, because you know, usually they were just there. You know, that is, in people, the university never looked at who cleans it and who takes the garbage out and so on, and you know what kind of lives they have in that of this. So the study of women historically, and I'm just. And in departments of language as well, English especially was one of the first places where they started to reread Victorian novels and from the perspective of feminists or women, so on. You know, it educated all of us who were doing it, because in a sense, some of us had come from the working class, or, you know, were conscious of class differences, but most Americans are not conscious, you know, who are middle class or upper middle class, or don't think about class. So it's as if everything that happens to them is open to everybody. Then also we all learned from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was powerful. Not that they weren't sexist within the civil rights movement, and you know, but the movements themselves taught us how to think about. If we thought about women as not getting our due, and then we thought about women of certain classes and races not getting their due, it opened up for a lot of people who didn't think in class and racial terms, how to think in class and racial terms. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
yes, thank you. Yes, I was thinking of changes at the university. For instance, Humanidades, where we're working. The fact that there is an undersecretary of feminisms and of gender shows that change, because it's a more praxis question than the research centers. You know? So we're thinking of that, how those things take place hand in hand with the movements. You know? So yes, thank you for your answer.
No, thank you.
Thank you. The most repeated expression in this chat is Ana Contreras says, I didn't know about the case of hotel workers. This conference is very enriching for me. Thank you, Temma. Mariana says, hello, thank you for sharing this talk with us. So compelling, says Brian Cini. And Florencia Carlevaro Orosusa says, Temma, thank you so much for the talk. Muchísimas gracias, dice Nadia Sánchez, muy interesante. And we have Enrique Garguin that has another question.
Okay.
He says, Temma, thank you so much for your talk. I love how you link Me Too movements with other grassroots movements, showing the intense and diverse mobilization behind those movements that can otherwise might seem to emerge out of the blue. But also, it's kind of troublesome how much harder it still is to working class or Latino and African American women to reach visibility for their grievances. So Enrique asks you if you can extend on this last issue of I think it's the difficulties of how hard it is for working class and Latino and African American women to reach visibility for their grievances?
Well, I mean, one of the things was when you ask those women, they can tell you, that is one of the things about the Me Too movement. Those farm worker women, the 700,000 women workers, farm workers, know their story. Nobody just asked them, and nobody really allied with them. They immediately recognized. I mean, it wasn't as if these struggles weren't going on. It's when the Hollywood people, and I wouldn't say these struggles weren't just going on in the United States; they were going on everywhere. Pick a country, and it's going on. But it isn't that the women by class, by race, didn't know it was happening. It's that nobody who was studying labor struggles or political struggles ever asked their opinions or looked at them. And in some cases, they were being exploited within their class and their race as well. But also in other cases, they were too vulnerable. Unless somebody asked them, unless somebody offered a hand, they're too poor, they're too hopeless, they're too helpless. The authorities, the police, even these social workers, sometimes even the churches. Sometimes in some places I know, in some countries, it was the rebellious nuns, the nuns who started to challenge the Catholic hierarchy, who became the most radical, especially in some of the orders, where some of them left, and most of them had to leave the orders at Wells. But some of the most radical people in the 60s and 70s were these radical nuns, these Maryknolls, who had worked in Central America from the United States. A lot of the U.S. Nuns, especially the Maryknolls and some of those others, were U.S. people who, did their work, and they worked with people in Nicaragua. So they knew what was happening in Nicaragua. They knew what was happening. And they became very radicalized. And they were the ones, some had to leave the orders, but they became very radicalized. But they also, had a lot of confidence. They had a lot of confidence because they had the authority of the church for much of their lives. So they weren't easy to put down that they weren't telling the truth. I mean, nobody said they weren't telling the truth when they talked about Jesus. So they had the authority to just, confront people. A lot of them in El Salvador, Nicaragua, a huge number of the Maryknolls were killed, because they confronted the authorities. But so part of it is who begins to see that some of the problems that take over their lives and that have been part of their lives are really what other people are talking about. People they don't even notice for the most part. The people who clean rooms, who, people go to hotels and they never say, oh, I talked to this wonderful, maid in the hotel, or I learned this and she's doing that, or she does that. Or the people who clean, the universities that we're in, and, they have lives too. And often they're the first people fired and the people exploited, and then each other, it was like, one of my friends was involved in a study of a progressive group of feminist lawyers, and she, and they did studies of judges, male and female judges, and one of the things that came out is that these male judges generally sometimes were married to female lawyers or judges, and sometimes had daughters who were studying to be lawyers. They didn't care what happened to their wives, but they did not want their daughters to be discriminated against. So we called it the daughter leftists, because they would not, and they had power, and they had, and so they began to officiate in law and began to understand, the ways in which women, either as victims or as perpetrators, were treated and discriminated against in the courts of law. And that's still going on, because clearly law courts, and especially for women of color, as bad as they are for all people of color, they're worse for women of color. So, but what happened is the movements gave people courage. And the combination of having people who had power, and Oprah Winfrey is a power in the United States. Everybody, I think, or many millions and millions of people want to be her friend, and for her to tell a story about her life, and to tell a story about the people who are working, makes them notice those people. So it matters that people overcome class differences, and that they overcome racial differences, and that they begin to understand and place themselves and place their families and place things they don't like and they like. I'm going on too long, but it's both promising and then very frightening, because sometimes people get punished tremendously in any country when they try to raise up these questions, and most people would rather be left alone and don't want to fight political issues. So, but one of the things that happened with this is that everybody had a mother. Everybody had a mother, and they when you could make them think that this could be their mother, that opened their eyes. Sometimes they didn't like their mothers, sometimes they didn't want to change, but at least it was a way to try to say, do you want your mother? And if you had a daughter, do you want your daughter treated in this way? And nobody wanted that.
Well, Temma, there is another comment and question is from Nadia Sanchez. I read it in Spanish because she put it in Spanish. We can switch into English. She says, trabajo en la administración pública hace 15 años y hace 4 soy delegada sindical. Es bastante complicado educar, entre comillas, a las personas mayores de 50 años sobre el respecto, o la ley Micaela. The Micaela Act is, probably you can explain, Cecilia, better in English.
No.
Yeah. I finished that. Supuestamente es obligatorio para todos, it's mandatory to everybody. They instruct about this law that Cecilia is going to explain, pero solo los más jóvenes entienden la importancia del tema.
I will think of something.
Short explanation of Micaela.
In connection to that, sorry, Hernan.
No, if you can give a short explanation to Micaela Act, probably Temma knows it, but.
The Micaela law is the one that promotes that people in the administration and in all institutions, like for instance, universities or courts or administrative work, should receive some instruction as regards against sexism, trying to work with the structural questions that have to do with harassment and sexism and sexual discrimination. So the question has to do with teaching that does not always get to or get a good answer, especially with elderly people. I mean, what Nadia says is that younger people are more receptive, more sensitive to these questions, but sometimes it's difficult to change people's minds when they are older. Yeah. And I was thinking, yes, of this structural question that is missing sometimes.
Right. No, I think what happens there, and I was just remembering, that I happened to be at there was a political movement, and then afterwards we went to somebody's house and they had made a big soup and everybody was in the kitchen getting ready to eat their soup all together. And there was an older couple who actually I knew, not from politics, but because they were the parents of my cousin's wife. And so I knew them a little bid socially. I didn't know them very well, but I knew who they were. And they were political progressives and had been involved in various things. But they had run a small hotel at a certain point earlier in their lives, and the gentleman was was used to talking to people in a very theatrical way, and also making jokes all the time. And the problem a lot of places is humor is wonderful, but it doesn't transcend politics. That is, some things you would just never say because politically it's racist or it's sexist or something. And you might have laughed at it at some point in your life, but you know you would never do it again. But some of the older people, and this time, my cousin's and my cousin-in-law's father, you know, did it, and people were nasty to him. You know, they were, and I felt very bad for him. And then I just took him away, you know, and talked to him a little bit. And then because I knew him socially, he said, "Oh, you know, this is the thing." And he wasn't, you know, but it's partly, there's a way that, you know, often as political activists, we're not good as teachers. Sometimes we don't, you know, if a student says something ridiculous, you usually can try to work it through so they're not humiliated. But often our response to somebody who expresses themselves in a way that's either racist or sexist or somehow, we just slam them. And sometimes we should just slam them, but other times it's sort of worth, you know, kind of turning it around or taking time to talk to people. And I think it is sometimes worth talking to older, you know, colleagues. I mean, you can't, it's hard. It's been particularly hard in the unions because in the United States as elsewhere, unions have seniority, and especially in certain industries, it's all men and white men. And that's always been a problem in racial struggles in the United States as well, because it's not as if Black men or Latino men never rise. Now there's more movement now that the unions are practically broken and that there's hardly any, you know, and the factory work isn't really very available, but still. But there was a kind of way that you could try to, you know, to, in a sense, work with people, you know, and familiarize. Sometimes it's about relating to family, sometimes it's about, you know, talking through. But sometimes you just want to punch them in the nose, and that's a bad thing. You know, sometimes you just want to say, "Stop this," and sometimes you do have to say, "Just stop this." You know, you can't. You know, this is not acceptable, or let's go for a walk, take them out of the thing. And it's not always older people. It's often people who, you know, are themselves strangers in that particular group, and they're being very defensive or so on. But it's and sometimes you just have to say, "Hey, be quiet. This is, you know, you're being mean," or something. You just have to, but you can't, you know, call somebody something. You can't say you're a fascist, which sometimes you want to say to people. That it's not usually productive. You can say it if you need to in your rage, say it, but it's not productive. So part of it is, are they so far out and so reactionary that you just can't allow it to go on? But usually it's better to be able to convince people in some way, and it's not, you know, you have to do it. And around sexism, it's also an issue because a lot of people, and in a lot of cultures, you know, sexual jokes and so on are part of what is accepted, and it has a family background and it has social background. And so denouncing them, you can say, "Look, we don't say that anymore because it hurts people," or "You wouldn't want to hurt so-and-so." And most people don't want to hurt anybody, you know. So you can, you know, but it's very bad unless somebody is a kind of real fascist and a real authoritarian. It's just very bad to just take them on, and, you know, and because unless you just really want to drive them out. And there are times when you do, but for the most part, you kind of want to win people over. You want to somehow get them to change, and they change more when they think that there's something in it for them, and that there's something that they recognize. So I don't have good answers for that either. But
sorry, just one more little question about connected to this, because what Nadia Sanchez suggested, commented about Ley Micaela and this need of instruction. I was thinking about the example you gave, Temma, about the women hotel workers, mm-hmm. and how they were given these alarm mm-hmm. devices so that they were, well, that was good for them to be safe. But wouldn't some measure, I know, for instance,
punishing people.
what did they do with the male workers that used to harass? Was any measure taken about that, or
It's
with the male workers, for instance?
Still, there are some unions that which have very strong women's constituents within the unions. That is, and there are strong numbers of women. For women who work, who are minorities in largely industries dominated by men, and this goes for African American men and women in places that are dominated by white people, where they're the only Black people there or only Latinos there. It's just harder to do, and there you have to use union things. If it gets, you have to try to say, "Hey, this is no fun. Would you do this?" If you can't make it a joke, then you just have to, you have to report them and try to get the union to help you work this out, because you should not be humiliated or suffer from this kind of thing. And if you can't work it out at a personal level, you've got to work it out collectively. And it's not good for the union either to do these kind of things. It's not good for the general cause to have somebody who is a racist or a sexist who is abusing other people. It's not good for the solidarity, because you don't want to drive the people out or not let them in, because the union is stronger if you have all of the people who work in it in the union. That's in the United States, where you have, some places are fewer and fewer places have closed shops, what we call closed shops, where you have to belong to a certain union to work in a certain place. And that's been almost, and now in the United States, fewer than 9% of the population is in unions. There's no union. I mean, the union movement in some unions exists, but most of the production and most of other things do not have unions. So women are in some of these unions, but 9% of all industry, and there's less industry in the United States. I mean, that's also part of it. There's just less industry, but it's not just that. It's just that they're, people have been pushed out of the unions, and people, so I didn't answer your question, but I think it's a question of there has to be a kind of process, and some of what the unions are trying to do, where there are large numbers of where they've begun to fight about women of color, women, people of color, and built that union consciousness. They have better luck, but in some places they have to go to state union interlocutors, and that's hard too, because some of them are wonderful people, but some of them are bureaucrats who have this job, and it's a good job, it pays regularly, it gives them benefits and so on. Not everybody in the United States has a job that gives them social security, that gives them benefits of Social Security. There are a lot of jobs. So you have this incredibly inegalitarian system, and so any group that tries to organize a group of people is doing something better. Organize them for certain kind of advances is doing better than any group any group of people that is all alone. But it's a terrible situation. I don't know, but
thanks.
But the farm workers are this union of the farm workers in California and in Florida too they've been fighting like mad, and it's really been the women and the people of color, and both Latinos and others. But there's enormous discrimination against Mexican Americans, Central Americans, in all of these businesses in the United States. And this question about the border is a racial question as well as an immigrant question, as well as others, and the discrimination against people from Central America is gets worse every day, and the women especially, because they're being harassed by everybody. And so this union of farm workers is a miracle, and it's a miracle that these women made, because these are the most vulnerable people. you can imagine. But they fight for water rights, and they fight for, clean water, and they organize in different groups. And it's a whole, it feels, I'm an optimist, so I have to feel that this isn't the fight at the end of the world, but some days I feel like it's the fight at the end of the world, that it seems hopeless.
Well, that's
well, I can't hear you, Anand.
Sorry, that's very amazing of your talk, and I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but it's how you connect the stories to make your argument, and there is a powerful idea of history and how history connects with everyday life issues and issues of political participation, democracy, and all your interests that are within your work, no? And I think that the topic of this session was connections, no? And I think there are very interesting things to think about connections in your talk that I could ask you to elaborate a little more if you please want. What is the connection between the social movement, in this case the Me Too, with the previous history, the long history of practices of direct democracy that make them possible, and the other, this long history, this long march behind the emergence of a social movement. And the other issue is the issue of impact, how this action impact and opens doors for to call into question other forms of discrimination, exploitation, the situation of migrants, the struggles for the use of water, and so on. And so looking at the past and looking to the present, there are all these connections that is very interesting to think about. And well, my question is that you can say a little more about these connections and how the arguments and the demand on these burning issues of sexual harassment actually open doors to think about other forms of discrimination, exploitation, segregation, and so on. We have this, I was thinking about the previous talk also by Alejandro Berti, this idea that, well, gender always was was in the place, and was very hard to discuss this place that was the secondary contradiction, but now it seems to be at the center of a revolution, and the ways in which it can spread different forms to fight for a more compelling sense of democracy, participation, mobilization, and so on. So I mixed a lot of questions, but I don't know if you can say a little more about all these things.
It's a big question, and it has many parts. It's that, I mean, it raises these questions that are, hard, impossible to answer in some ways. That is, why do some people have enough? What is that point where people just say, I can't take it anymore, I won't do this, or this is the line, I won't cross that line? Is it individual? Is it an issue of psychology? Is it an issue of what your expectations are, and that people who expect nothing have a hard time fighting for something because they don't think they deserve it, or they don't think they're capable of achieving it? And how do you inculcate to people a notice that everybody has a right to justice? That everybody has that right, and that, so part of it is both psychological, but it's also historical. How does somebody break out of how does somebody use their experiences? Everybody is in some kind of family or some unit of collectivity, and they're born into some unit of collectivity. So who breaks out? I mean, in the United States, there's always been this individualism. It was inculcated, it has been inculcated, continues to be as almost a religion. The individual is the most important figure, but people challenge that. I mean, and people challenge it because they couldn't make it as individuals, or the area of greatest pain was the degree to which they were treated as subordinate individuals and so on. So some of it is personal and how people figured out the world and how they fit into it. But some of it has to do with, fighting against oppression. I mean, some people fight against it. Some people embrace things that make them feel less oppressed or exploited. Some people, and the question is when and where and how can you change, and who has the right answer. You always have to, you have to kind of respect other people, because you may have found an answer that works for you, but it may not work for other people. And then the question is, how do you negotiate that, because they're your friends, because they're your colleagues, because they're your oppressor and you need to get out from under their thumb. And so, I mean, these are the human questions, and intellectual life, it runs on the same frequency as other issues of determination and how you work things through. So, part of it is, why are some people racist? That's a question that. So what's in it for them to be racist? Why does anybody want to feel like they are better than somebody else? What do they get to do as a result of that? So there are certain questions where you think, well, these are psychological questions, and many of them are, but also they usually have some material basis in them as well. And so the question is, where do you begin when you're, say, as an historian, where do you begin at looking for answers to a question? And sometimes my students say, well, I don't have a question. I say, yes, you do. You have a question. Everybody's got questions about everything. Should you get up at 9 or 10? Should you brush your teeth that day or not? They have all kinds of questions. Everybody makes decisions and questions all the time. And so the part of it is, what do you care about? And if you don't care about equality or justice, why not? I mean, there are these questions about that where difference should lead you to try to, situate oneself intellectually with other people, in terms of, it's lonely if the United States, ideology is the individual self-development, but the individual is crazy. That kind of individual who's not dependent and drawing on the strength of other people is a loony. It's just a crazy person that you can't. We all live in society, and the ways in which we negotiate it and the ways in which historically people have negotiated it is a way to understand why it happened that way. Why did people not stand up at a certain point when other people were being, persecuted? Why did people accept that? Was it fear for themselves individually? Often it was. But why did they think they were going to escape? If it wasn't, once they finished with them, why wouldn't they go to us? Why wouldn't the notion of collectivity be a permanent notion? And it is for some people, and it isn't for other people. So, go on. And so part of any historical problem, if we go back to history, is why will people struggle over certain kinds of things? Whether it's domination, or whether it's equality, or whether it's getting out from under themselves and getting a better place in their life, or helping other people get a better place in theirs. It's always a question of what's at stake. And I think as historians, we don't always ask that question. Why are they doing this? Well, if we don't like them, why are they doing this? What's in it for them? And they can be crazy, like certain presidents of the United States. I mean, they can be totally egocentric, monsters. But you still want to know, who are their family? Why is it this? What happened? Why are they situating? And then why does everybody else, as a collectivity, let them get away with it? Why don't people join together when often that's the best way to solve a problem historically? Why don't they ally? Because we're always stronger with other people. But why do people think of an individual, especially in the United States, that from kindergarten on, people are inculcated with the needs of individual self-development? Well, the lone wolf is crazy. You know, the lone wolf is isolated. You know, who wants to be a lone wolf? But it, you know, it's part of it. So then you ask a question: why do certain political formations come into being? We're all in this place where there are some we know very well in both our countries, which we do not want repeated. But how did that happen in the first place, and why? You know, what could we do to make it sure that that doesn't happen in the future? So these aren't questions of, you know, vanity. These are questions of life and death, I think. And so some of them, you know, lead us to, you know, just examine stuff that should be everyday life, you know, that we think of, you know, what do people do when they go home from, you know, from marching for the left or the right? What do they do? You know, how do they treat the people who are their neighbors or the people who clean up after them? You know, what are those people? What are their lives? How do they intersect? But I think those are the historical questions as well. I mean, but there may be life and death questions for us now. You know, they're the same ones, because if we don't figure this out, you know, the world could end. You know, we don't have water. We can't defend against, you know, oceans overcoming things. So, you know, we have to figure this out. And that's what makes history interesting, it seems to me. But I don't have a clear answer to any of it. It's just that you look at something and you need to solve it because your life depends on it, and other people's life you love. The lives depend on it, and you have to solve it, or you have to try to. So that's a long-winded answer to that.
Yes, very interesting Temma. I have very interesting, well, many issues to think about. Now, I want to come back because there is another comment of Nadia Sanchez.
Okay.
Following what we were talking before. She says, the fact is that if you said stop, or when you said sometimes you need to say stop, the people you say stop think that the one that is wrong is you. The one that is wrong is the one that said stop. And that's what she's bringing here as a comment of what you were saying about saying stop, and how people sometimes that is in that situation, and well, I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps the person who has suffered the harassment is the one that is blamed later.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there you have to make alliances with other people who see what power differences. I mean, one of the things historians claim to have something to say about, but often don't, you know, really have something. It has to do with power differences. At what point do people get crushed? I mean, where they're saying the right thing, but they can't keep saying it. Nobody will listen and nobody will do it, or they'll be punished for saying it. How do they negotiate that? How do they step back? Sometimes you have to step back. But I think that you know, you can't, it's like theories of things. You can have different theories about how things fit together. And, you know, as historians, we do it, even though historians deny, to some extent, traditional historians deny that they have any systems. But you know, part of it is that you have to, you know, you sometimes have to then open up the question in a different way, or you have to change the subject to be able to raise the same power relation, you know, question the same power relation, but in a different setting. Sometimes people have memories of very bad things that happened to them that you don't have, and you're using an example that elicits that memory for them, and you don't even know where it's coming from. And that happens with human relationships anyway. So one is to change it back. There was a very funny article when I was very young, and it was when everybody was a Marxist, and at least in my history circles. And some brother and sister wrote a book called Peter Rabbit and the Grundrisse, about the Grundrisse is part of, Marxism that absolutely nobody understands. And it was kind of a notebook that Marx wrote at some point when he was very young about all this stuff. And I think about it, that sometimes you get to that point where you're the rabbits and you just want to, you want to solve it. And the Grundrisse is not your answer. You don't go to high theory, you don't go to low theory, you just, just try to see it in human terms of what, how would you get out of this? And sometimes it's a family term. Sometimes it's about your best friend who hurts you terribly because they know how to do it. Sometimes it's about something else. How do you as an individual figure out what it is that you really need to solve? What question you really need to, take apart? And that's a personal question, but it's also a question about intellectual life too. There's some problems you can't solve at that time, or you better not, because the solutions aren't you can't defend the solutions, or you can't really think of a way to activate them. And so, you make these other decisions. But one of the things about history is that, I think history is the last refuge of dilettantes, and the last refuge of dilettantes, of people who, study history because you can learn a lot from it, but it isn't always what you really want to learn, or what helps you, what you need to know, or what really makes your life better. And, all of those things can be very bad. It's a very threatening situation, but it also is a very compelling one, because you feel as if you are a participant with other people in a collective endeavor, life and history, and that you both have obligations to yourself and them, but you also are part of a world historical movement of trying to make life better for large masses of people. And I think that's too much to lay on a discipline, but I think that's what history does. I mean, when you do it really, the stuff I like to read, it does that. It really answers questions it may not set out to answer, but in the course of explanation and in the course of evocation of what people did at certain times in certain places under certain conditions, it's a liberatory idea. So I don't know if that answers anybody's question, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
No, it's great. There are many things. We go back.
Yes, and we come back to the
different
idea
issues and the connection between many discussions. It's very interesting, and I think it's very compelling for the people that are following us. There was, I think it's one of the talks that were more comments and more interaction. That was a great session, I think. I don't know if you want to. We don't have any more
I was just
comments
saying,
or questions.
I was just saying how, Temma, you spoke of alliances as a way of, solving these situations. And we come back to the idea of a collective, and then the Me Too movement as a collective. So we come back to this idea of alliances and collectives.
Right.
Cool.
Right. Well, it's very, very lonely. I've never understood this notion about individualism. I've never understood the notion about, the benefits of individualism. I mean, it's fine to be alone a lot of the time, and we all need to be alone some of the time. But this notion of individualism is kind of a lonely notion. I mean, you have fun with other people, you can have fun with yourself, by yourself, but it's often nice to talk to people and hear what they have to say and so on. So the sociability of shared intellectual endeavor is one of the great pleasures of being a human being. So I've never understood why people don't want it. Why shouldn't you?
Perhaps the question is that if someone says stop, and then that person is blamed, or she could look for some alliances and collectives, but those who criticize her, those who resist changes, also make collectives. So it's really difficult sometimes to break those collectives.
Right.
That support harassment.
Well,
perhaps that's
no. You're absolutely right. I think it's often. I don't know. I often think humor. I was once going to write a book about humor and political humor, because humor always has a kind of, on one hand, it has, we like humor, it makes us feel good, but it also often has a hostile, or at least an argumentative side to it. And it's often showing contradictions, and so humor can be very mean, and it can be very hurtful, and it can be, on the other hand, it can be very emancipatory. And sometimes, it's like little kids. I remember being very annoyed when people made me laugh when I was in a snit of some sort, when I wanted to just figure something out, or I was mad about something. And, if you make somebody laugh when they're feeling very angry, it's both liberatory and infuriating, but it is that sort of, it's a kind of dialectic where, anger has its place, where it sometimes concentrates your intellect in certain places, but also humor has a place because it explodes a lot of the preconceptions and other things, and it makes you rethink things and make them move around in some ways that they didn't before. But it's in history, it's often, you often remember these stories that just didn't fit. They didn't fit because somebody acted out of character, or somebody made some decision that was not like all the other decisions they made. Then you write about it as a historian, because you try to understand these different things. Human beings are infinitely creative, and even in their humor or in their fury, they're infinitely creative. And so part of it is to see, where does this come from? What is it based on? How do you get beyond, a certain point of confusion, or of oppositions, where people can't talk to each other and don't want to understand each other. And then how can you just respect difference? Are there places where something you believe fervently isn't something somebody else is ever going to believe? And can you let it be at that? And there's a lot of things you can, and some things you can't. Racism, murder, things like that. You can't just let them be. But other things are just part of the difference people are. They're infinitely creative. They're infinitely imaginative. They're infinitely different. And part of that is the pleasure of being different human beings, of having different human beings in your life. I don't know. It sounds Pollyanna, but I think it's part of it is partly that there's no solution. There are various questions and then various answers, and that's what fulfills life in many ways. There's no final answer. I think religious people may think that and may find comfort in finding ultimate statements and ultimate beliefs, but I don't believe there are ultimate anything. So. I think you have to stop cruelty, and you have to promote creativity, and so mushy stuff like that. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been so
Thank you,
great.
Temma. Thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful talk. Many things that appear that we can connect with the other topics of the cycle, this issue of the individual and the collective, and how we think about stories that tell us about some individuals, but how is permanently this connection with the collective, and how think ourselves as in collective networks that are very important for the issues of feminism, but also for other issues that we were discussing here, historical memory, and all the topics that we were discussing in this cycle. And we want to tell you that people is very happy to hear this talk from you. I think this is very instructive, very encouraging in these difficult times to have your positive views of the possibilities of social action, democracy, and participation, even in so difficult times as the current times here and there and everywhere in the world. And we will continue with this conversation. It opens a lot of ideas, the struggles that you are working on is sexual harassment, but it's also the struggle for water and democracy and so on and on. And we have to finish now this talk. We will continue with this cycle, and we will continue in touch to think how we can continue with this exchange that I think is very it's very compelling for all people. We have to invite now to your colleague Bonnie Smith, that is who is delivering the next talk next Saturday at 6 p.m. It's Saturday is 27th. The 27th, we have another professor from Rutgers University who specializes in European history and will talk to us.
And the world.
Saturday or Thursday?
And the world, yeah, and the world and this international history. And well, that she had an important book on how gender relates to the historical profession and the formation of the historical profession in the 19th century. And I think she's going to talk about, well, how she elaborated this book and how she started to think about these connections. The title of the presentation will be Complication in the Gender of History from the 1990s to the present, by Bonnie Smith from Rutgers University. So you all are invited for our 8th talk next Saturday, next Thursday.
Oh, Thursday.
Thank you, Temma.
Thank you
again.
Thank you.
Well, there are some comments. Samantha Rodriguez, a colleague from the it's Spanish. It will be here. It's our language department, language and literature department. Samantha Rodriguez says, excellent and necessary conversation. Thank you. Excelente y necesaria conversación. Gracias. Comment from Samantha, another colleague and friend that was following the talk also. And well, thank you, Temma. I don't know how to repeat that, because I think it was very, very nice for all of us to hear you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the wonderful.
Yes, I'm very pleasant to the way you speak. So it was very nice to follow you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was very nice to.
I agree with Hernan and all the things that were told, and also this very nice.
You know, for me, it's been a great pleasure, and it's wonderful to meet you all and see some of you again, and to just feel at home. And you know, these are hard times, but I feel like you know, we'll get through them. We have to get through them, and we will get through them. You know, we will have to get through them, and we will get through them. But it's a hard time. So this is so invigorating. It makes me feel alive again. You know, to be able to talk to you and think about kindred spirits and people who share goals for justice and peace and equality and all the good things and that human beings are capable of, and we don't have to fix on all the bad things they're capable of too. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you.
Nadia Sanchez adds a last comment. She says, yes, it's just like that. It's so hard. Well, we are trying to build some dialogues and some collectivity with this opportunity, and we will continue in touch and think what else we can do in the near future, not in the long distance future, but in the near future with other activities and collective initiatives. So we say bye-bye, see you, abrazos, hasta